Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me and for having me. And for those of you who are here, thank you for coming. And for those of you who might be watching online, thank you for watching in the future. Um, as our lovely host said, my name is Victoria Litman. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and then talk about this research that I've done. And then I'll really look forward to some question and answer. So I am a law professor, as Ansi said, at Roger Williams University School of Law, and that is in Rhode Island, which is in the New England Northeast part near Boston. I teach tort law, and then I also teach electives in drug law, cannabis, and psychedelic related law, as well as constitutional, First Amendment, religion related topics. I am also a fellow in psychedelic law and spirituality at the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Bioethics, and Biotechnology at Harvard Law School. And this work that I'll be sharing with you today about the necessity of regulating spiritual care, about the law and policy of psychedelic chaplaincy. This work was presented at ICPR, the Interdisciplinary Conference on Psychedelic Research, in the Netherlands last summer, throughout different venues this year, and at a conference at Harvard Law School last summer. So the work I'm sharing today will be published. The book chapter is done in an open source academic press volume. So I'm not going to touch on every single citation for everything I share with you, but it is all written out and cited. And if you find it interesting and relevant to your work, you will be able to access that soon. The title of the presentation, right? The necessity of regulating spiritual care. That's the name of the presentation I've been giving. The book chapter is called The Law and Policy of Psychedelic Chaplaincy. I'm going to explain what I mean by spiritual care, by chaplaincy, by psychedelics. So we'll get into it. My background, I have a divinity degree, an undergraduate degree in religion. So I have always been interested in the intersection of psychedelics and religion. I've published and written about the psychedelic church movement in the United States. I'd be very interested to know if that exists in Finland, but in the United States, we have, in theory, strong religious freedom law. And so we've had a lot of communities that use psychedelics come up in that way. And that really brought me into psychedelic policy and law. But then I had the opportunity to join the project on psychedelic law and regulation at the Petrie-Flom Center at Harvard. And that really pushed me to think about issues related to religion in a clinical, medical research context. This hopefully isn't a surprise to most of you. I don't quite know my audience, but there's been a lot of research about the ways that psychedelics can provoke powerful, meaningful, mystical, spiritual, religious. I'm going to use all kinds of different terms, but experiences that are beyond maybe what we would think of as clinical or scientific. And this reality that even in a clinical setting or a medical setting, people have these experiences, that gives rise to a lot of ethical, legal, and clinical questions, especially because people are spiritually vulnerable during these experiences. So the core argument, my thesis for this research, is that spiritual care, especially through chaplaincy, and I'll talk more about what those terms mean, but that it's necessary for it to be integrated into regulated psychedelic services, which I will also explain what that means, because I argue that it is ethically necessary, which is where we'll focus a lot of our time, medically beneficial, right? The research shows that there's benefits for the medical outcomes for these type of spiritual experiences. And at least in the US context, which is what I'm speaking about mostly, economically viable, right? So we're going to talk a bit about it, but the long and short is that right now in the US, psychedelic therapy is expensive. And the prospects of psychedelic therapy is that it will be expensive. And part of the expense is the expense of medical providers. And so embracing spiritual care is not just ethically necessary, which I'll spend a lot of time on, is not just medically beneficial, but I also argue is economically viable, important, beneficial. So that's the argument. And now I'm going to spend the rest of this time defining my terms, giving you the argument about why it's necessary. And then I'll talk a little bit about how I actually would propose that we integrate spiritual care into the psychedelic world. But I do know that some of that might be specific to the United States. So I'll share a lot, but be mindful that it might not be immediately relevant, all of it, to your work. So some definitions. So what do I mean by psychedelics, right? That could be a whole talk. I don't know if you have agreed upon term in your society for what a psychedelic is. There, right, are the classic psychedelics, psilocybin, DMT, mescaline, and then there are other substances. Maybe LSD would also be a classic, MDMA, ketamine, right? Ketamine's a dissociative. In the United States, it's a debate whether or not ketamine is a psychedelic. I don't know if that same debate happens in Finland, but for the purposes of this work, I am defining psychedelics really broadly. And I know that each substance has unique legal and medical and clinical uses and risks and different access under different laws. So I understand that I'm painting with a very broad brush. I'm just saying psychedelics, but I am happy to include anything that you would think of as a psychedelic. That's what I'm talking about. And I will leave the debate about what is a psychedelic, and if it matters what we call a psychedelic, I'll leave that for another time. So a psychedelic service. So in my thesis, I talk about the fact that spiritual care is ethically necessary, medically beneficial, and economically viable for psychedelic services. And I don't know if this is a term that you've been exposed to, but in the United States, we use the term psychedelic services when we're talking about typically state-regulated psychedelic use. When I'm talking about psychedelic services, and I'll explain what that means in a second, I'm including, again, very broad. This paper, I'm not getting into the nitty-gritty. I'm more talking about more generally why we need spiritual care. So when I talk about psychedelic services, I'm talking about clinical, FDA-regulated, medical model, which is sort of like this other pathway in the United States. And then I'm talking about state regulated. So we have 3 states, Colorado, Oregon, and New Mexico, which have at the state level passed laws that allow for state regulated psychedelic access, but they require a facilitator or a clinician. And I'm including all of that when I'm talking about this proposal. I think the important thing to say, right, there are different regulations at the federal FDA level and at the state level in the United States. And, this is a different topic, but the federal law is clear that the state law programs are not federally legal, but our federal government isn't functioning very well. And so that's part of it. There is no federal law enforcement against these state programs that are breaking federal law. But these state programs, especially Oregon and New Mexico, are very tightly limited, regulated. But the provider, the facilitator, does not have to be a medical doctor. They actually don't even need to be any kind of healthcare clinician, which is interesting, especially in Oregon and in Colorado. The requirements are pretty minimal. You have to have like a high school diploma, and then you go through a training program, which is part of their regulated framework. Colorado, if you are interested in this area and where there are progressive laws. Colorado's law is, I would say, probably the most progressive maybe in the world, certainly in the United States. So Colorado has this legal regulated market where they're going to develop these healing centers for 4 different substances: ibogaine, mescaline, DMT, and psilocybin. And then they also have a decriminalized, self-regulated social sharing model. But even in that model, facilitation is part of the norm, right? The idea under the law in Colorado, you're allowed to not allowed to buy a substance from someone else, but you're allowed to pay for the support services, and then they can gift you the substance. And the implication, right, is that we're talking about, whether we're talking about, state regulated use in New Mexico, Colorado, or Oregon, or we're talking about FDA research or existing clinical use with ketamine, which is the only FDA approved broadly defined psychedelic, we're almost always talking about facilitated use, meaning that people are going in and they're trusting some other person to be there while they're there. Maybe that person is providing therapy while they're having the psychedelic experience. Maybe it's a little less directed. It's very vague and ambiguous what that therapy is, and that was some of the challenges through the FDA of approving, for example, MDMA assisted therapy. I'll just say I've argued in other online journals that we should take the therapy and the drug and separate them, and we should create psychedelic dispensaries where people could access the drug and then bring it home with them, or bring it to the therapist of their choice. But right now, that is not how it is. And so when I think about this project of talking about spiritual care in a facilitated use psychedelic services context, to me, it's a little bit about harm reduction. It's a little bit about making these experiences as best as we can be, knowing that I also think that you shouldn't have to go be with a specific facilitator in order to access psychedelics. So that was kind of a lot of background, but I think it's important for you to understand my argument about spiritual care, to understand that in the United States, at least, in order to access, like, you can't go to like a smart shop, like in the Netherlands. You have to go to an on-site facility, use the substance there with the supervision or facilitation of someone there in every regulated model. And in Colorado, you don't have to, but the substance isn't regulated, and facilitation is still part of it. So psychedelic services is basically every legal regulated framework in the United States is a psychedelic service where someone is having a facilitated use. And that's the universe that I'm talking about. So I use the word chaplains, psychedelic chaplains. I don't know. Maybe someone can tell me if this is a profession that's as broadly utilized where you live. But a chaplain is, and I'll talk a little bit more later about their training and their backgrounds, but generally they're spiritual care providers. There's an education and a certification program, and chaplains in the United States, and I think beyond, right, function in a lot of different places. You have military chaplains, you have hospital chaplains, prison chaplains, school chaplains, people that provide spiritual support, not specifically usually a religious leader, although sometimes they are a rabbi, a priest, a minister, an imam, but someone who is there to provide spiritual support. So we talked about what psychedelics are, we talked about what psychedelic services are, and what chaplains are. Interesting. Yeah, someone just said it's a very Christianity connected term. Henry did. Yeah, so American law and American culture, even though we talk about ourselves as like, there's this idea that American is like a place of religious freedom. There are a lot of ways in our language, in our law, in our culture, where Christianity and Christian terms are the norm. So legally, for example, a religious community is called a church. even though a church is obviously a Christian term. And certainly chaplains at their origin were a Christian function in early America. But now you have a lot of interfaith chaplains, you have Buddhist chaplains, humanist chaplains, chaplains that are not affiliated with any specific denomination. And I went to divinity school at Union Theological Seminary in New York City, which is part of Columbia University. And the divinity school that I went to, there were a lot of different people from all kinds of faiths who wanted to become chaplains. So yeah, definitely Christian roots here too. But now, I don't know. I mean, we're still a Christian majority country, so a majority of chaplains are probably still Christian, but certainly not all of them. And for what I'll explain in a bit is chaplains are ideally trained to not impose their own religious views on someone else. Great. Yeah, it's helpful to understand a bit more about Finland. So the first part of my paper and my book chapter is the necessity piece. So why am I arguing that spiritual care is necessary part of psychedelics, psychedelic services? One of the ways when I'm giving a really short talk on this is one of the ways that I introduce this idea is I pose a question, which I think anyone involved in psychedelics has maybe considered, which is whether or not these are spiritual, divine, sacramental substances, knowing that different substances might be different, that have some medical benefit in a modern Western view of medicine, or are these drugs, are these medicines, right, that happen to have these weird mystical side effects? And people have written about this, right, in the medical literature. Should we like ignore the mystical parts of psychedelics? Are they just these weird side effects? Or is the spiritual, mystical experience, is that actually the medical benefit? Is having that religious or spiritual experience itself the benefit? Yeah, I'm not going to answer that question right now. I don't know the answer to that question. I think it's a really interesting question that challenges what we think about when we think about what is medicine versus spirit, physical, body, mind, right? It's a loaded question about whether these are, sacraments or medicines, sacraments that have medical benefits, medicines with spiritual side effects. But I say, when I give the punchy talk, right, it doesn't matter, because either way, whether you think that they are medicines or you think that they are sacraments, either way, there is a general consensus in the research community that there are, at least in most instances, religious or spiritual or mystical or divine or philosophical, right? There's so many words that you could use to describe an aspect of psychedelic experiences. And my argument is that we need to do something about it, right? So when I argue that spiritual care is ethically necessary, I focus on the fact that patients under psychedelics are highly suggestible. I would expect that's a term you may have heard before, but the idea around suggestibility, and there's a bit of debate, but I think there still is significant consensus that when someone is under the influence, especially of a larger dose of a psychedelic, they are likely to be influenced by their environment, by what people say to them, by what they see, by what they experience. I mean, arguably, that's part of the effect and the benefit, is that your brain becomes, more permeable, flexible. You might have heard of this concept, set and setting. It's very prevalent, at least, in the, I heard at ICPR too, right? That your psychedelic experience is going to be heavily shaped by your mindset, and your setting, your physical setting and your environment, and that both of those will play a role in what kind of experience that you have. And right, when you're doing psychedelics, if people, especially, it's really popular in the US, you go to festivals or churches, right? People uh, have more maybe control over their set and their setting. They get to make decisions, or less control depending on where they are and what they're doing. And when you go into a facilitated, regulated model, you are giving up some of your ability to control your set and setting, maybe because you want more security and more safety, or you want regulated medicine. There's all these reasons why you might do that, but you're giving up a bit of that set and setting to the people around you, and that includes your facilitator. So, the suggestibility aspects of psychedelics, and the ability to occasion these religious spiritual experiences, creates a real ethical risk in these facilitated settings of the facilitator or the clinician imposing their own ideas about religion onto the patient. So I'll introduce this term. It gets it gets used a lot in some research that is coming out of Emory. They have a Center for Psychedelics and Spirituality, which is very cool. There's a term they use called SERT experiences, SERT. Let's see, it's spiritual, existential, religious, and theological. So they talk about SERT experiences. The researchers at Emory talk about SERT experiences and the role of chaplains. And I am building on that work and talking about the legal piece. So again, the suggestibility and the propensity of psychedelics to occasion these SERT experiences is what creates this risk of what people call religious countertransference, where if a patient has some kind of religious or spiritual situation occur, then the therapist or clinician or facilitator might project their own ideas and beliefs onto a patient. And, there's a whole spectrum of what this looks like. And I touch on this in my chapter. And, so you might say some of it is really benign, right? I think you may have heard already from Matthew Johnson before. So he talks about this in his work, Consciousness, Religion, and Gurus, Pitfalls of Psychedelic Medicine. He also has a book chapter in the same volume that my chapter will be published in. But he talks about the practice of clinicians putting a Buddha into the therapy room. And I would say that's more of not totally benign, but I don't think that's quite actively harmful. But I do think that is an example of a clinician or a treatment protocol imposing a certain idea around religion or spirituality onto a patient, by putting Buddha in the room, or putting a Christian imagery in the room, or having people say Christian prayers. My dog is barking at me. Come on, Deli. You're okay. That all of this is an example of the way that a therapist might, even if it's not intending to be harmful, put their own religious views onto the patients. So there's a spectrum. Like I said, I think the Buddha imagery is not as harmful. I'd be interested to know what you think the tolerance would be in Finland for that kind of, bringing religion into the therapy room, clinical room. But there's been a spectrum. So another example I talk about in my chapter has to do with the Johns Hopkins clergy trial. So you may have heard about this recently. The news came out that the trial was finally published, but it was a research study from about almost 10 years ago, where a bunch of psychedelic naive clergy members, so people who had never done psychedelics before, rabbi, priest, minister, they were given psychedelics. And the idea was to study the religious experience that they had, whether or not it was sincere, real religious experience, if they could compare it to the experience that they've had otherwise. And there were some allegations related, and including when the study was published, there were some ethical concerns with how the study was facilitated, but some of those concerns related to the use of suggestive language and touch. So, if you tell a religious leader that their experience on psychedelics, when they are having that experience, that they were anointed by God, then that is really suggestive, right? Like that might skew the results of the research itself. And there have been allegations of that. And, I've also heard when I presented this work pushback that for some patients that religious imagery and imposition is a benefit. I'm just going to let my dog out because she's going to keep crying and I want to be able to focus. Give me 1 second. Here, Dudley. Thank you. So the clergy trial is one example. I think the last example I touch on my book chapter is the inner healer example. So there's been also research on this, and I don't know who's in the audience, and I'm an academic, which is a privilege. So I get to be critical of what's happening in the world, and I understand that there's investment in industry and different views about what's happening in the US and globally related to psychedelic research. But there have been allegations, and I think some of them are interesting, related to the inner healer model, which I don't know how widespread that is, but the idea is in certain therapeutic protocols, including part of MAPS's MDMA or Lykos now, MDMA assisted therapy protocol, is this idea of telling a patient that they have an inner healer power. And the idea is, and I, as like someone who thinks that the self is really powerful and you might be able to build awareness of self and that might contribute to your healing, I can appreciate that. But I do worry about the risks of imposing that. Like, I think the inner healer paradigm is a theology. It's a belief. Right. And it's a belief about who has power and how healing occurs and how illness occurs. And that if you have someone in your clinic and you're telling them that they have an inner healer power and then they're unable to heal, that could be detrimental to them. Right. And I think for all of these examples, whether you're talking about a Buddha, whether you're talking about, touch and anointment and prayer, or you're talking about, giving someone a frame, like an inner healer frame, I think a lot of that is okay if the patient consents. And I will get into a bit about why I think chaplains would be a good, or spiritual care providers, or any clinician should really focus on consent for these types of issues, right? So on one spectrum, on one end of the spectrum, I don't think it's, I do think it's concerning if you're putting a Buddha in the clinical room. I do worry about the other end of the spectrum, which is brainwashing, right? Which is, we allow clinicians to come in and impose whatever view they want on patients. And I would say in the US especially, and I think globally, but I'm speaking from my experience, right? We have extreme ideologies, and psychedelics are used on both sides of any ideology. So, if we're not careful about making sure that we have high standards for how our clinicians interact with patients, then we're risking people being really impacted ideologically, philosophically, mentally by these experiences. So those are examples of the risks, right? And when I argue that spiritual care is necessary, I'm also responding to Matthew Johnson. So when he talks about the Buddha in the treatment room, he argues that, if we want to avoid those kind of pitfalls, he argues we should have a secular framework, that we should just completely ignore basically the spiritual religious parts and just do secular medicine. But I have a religious studies background, and I think I am trying to view eyes wide open. And he agrees with me when I explain this to him, right? That's not really possible. Like yes, a doctor can say, I'm going to perform my secular job, or a facilitator or a clinician, but they're still people. and they have their own ideas and views and beliefs. And if they're not trained to not impose them, that risk is still there. So, like I said, I build on the work coming out of the Emory Center, that we need to embrace the CERT experience, the spiritual, existential, religious, theological catch-all term. And we need to develop training and standards of care to support this. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute, but basically, ideally, we're going to have spiritual care providers, chaplains. I also talk about midwives, doulas. There are a whole category of providers that are actually trained to be present with people's spiritual, religious, the non-physical experiences that people are having. So, I will say, I think we can train clinicians, but at the end of the day, I don't want my heart surgeon providing spiritual care, just like I don't want my doula doing heart surgery, right? Like, I think that there's an element of respecting that there are different disciplines and they have different training and different skills. And yes, you might be able to train someone to do something, but that the spiritual care is itself a profession that does take training. But I also don't think that should stop us from helping create standards of care and training medical professionals as best as we can, understanding that they can't fully be, unless they get trained, spiritual care providers. So I think that's the basis for my ethics argument, that there's risks in this relationship. And we've seen other types of abuse and harm, sexual abuse and harm, financial abuse and harm. But I'm focusing in this piece on the religious and spiritual abuse and harm. So that's the ethics. The medical benefit piece, right? I say there's over 3,000 studies that support a link between religion and health, and the benefits of these types of experiences or involvement in spiritual or religious community and health. There's also some interesting research that proposes that there's a relationship between the intensity of a spiritual, existential, religious, theological, I'll just say it a million times, experience, and the medical benefit. So, in shorthand, the more you see God, the more you heal, which you can debate that. But there are some interesting data around that. And, it brings up all kinds of questions about, like I said, what is healing? What is medicine? And I strongly believe in science and medicine. I'm not questioning that. It's just how much our spirit and our mind also play a role in our physical healing. And the other piece of the medical benefit, which is interesting, is that it's not just about, oh, did you have a spiritual experience? It's about ongoing spiritual community. We might, think about that when we talk about like AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, other group therapy models, that there's value in community. Maybe that's part of why there's a positive relationship between religious or spiritual identity and community, and healing. I'll say a bit more when I talk about how chaplaincy can be integrated, but I think if we do include chaplains, then we're just elevating that medical benefit. So if people are already having spiritual experiences and we think there's medical benefit, then if we have chaplains there to help facilitate those or other spiritual care providers, those spiritual experiences, then that will just magnify the medical benefit, which truly I think is the goal of most people that are getting involved in psychedelic research, is how can we help people feel better and stay feeling better? So obviously the ethical issues are important, and I'm working on another article related to the liability, the legal issues, right? But I think the medical benefit is also really compelling, because if we want these to be effective treatments that help people, if we can figure out how to make them more effective, that would be great. And it costs actually less to have people join community and find meaning than it does to keep giving them drugs. So I find that argument really compelling. And then, there is the economic piece, right? So I mentioned this already, right? And, I've heard mixed things when I presented this work to chaplains. On one hand, chaplains wish they were paid more. They should be valued by our medical system more. On the other hand, they are more affordable. And so Yeah, the cost of the amount of time that you need a clinician, especially in the FDA context, but even in like Oregon, the cost of psychedelic therapy is thousands and thousands of dollars. And part of that is paying for a facilitator. And so, if we can, especially in the FDA medical context, have spiritual care providers, that might reduce the cost of therapy and actually make it more accessible to more people. Which again, I think when I think about the impact and the possibility of psychedelic medicine, I'm hoping for like widespread long-term impact. And the right now the economics don't make sense. And part of the issue at the state level is also because these state psychedelic programs are still federally illegal. And so they're subject to really harmful taxes. They have banking challenges, insurance challenges. I mean, I could talk more about it, but the model is not really designed to succeed. And that's part of the challenge. And so I do think it's worth, and I'm not just bringing that out of nowhere. The Emory did a whole study on chaplains and they brought in that economic piece. And so I think it's worthwhile to say that, but also to say chaplains should be paid more and valued more. And right now they are a more affordable option. So I got the ethical reasons, the medical reasons, the economic reasons, and that's part one of my favorite. Part two, is getting more into how chaplains can be integrated. So I talk about what a chaplain is. They have to go to divinity school. They have to do a clinical experience. They get trained in different religions. They have strong religious literacy. They have ethical duties not to impose their own views on patients. And there's a forum for reporting these type of ethical violations. So I think all of that is a good foundation and framework, which could be beneficial in a psychedelic therapy context. So when I think about, so that's kind of like what's a chaplain. When I think about how chaplains could fit in, and this, I think this is somewhat, I know that there are people in Europe who are talking about psychedelics in this way, that they're typically, when you think about psychedelic services, again, facilitated psychedelic use, there are 3 stages that people talk about. There's the preparation sessions, there's the experience itself, and then there's the integration. So preparation meaning preparing for, the experience meaning we're actually doing the drugs. The integration is the after, the bringing what you learned while you're on psychedelics into your life. So in my chapter, I explore the ways that chaplains could fit into all of the different pieces. So for preparation, there's already been arguments. Some of my colleagues from Harvard have published about informed consent and the importance of a really strong, perhaps enhanced informed consent process. And I argue that chaplains should be part of that process. At the very least, patients should have a right to either see a chaplain or waive that right. But I would hope that if you tell someone, hey, maybe you should talk to a chaplain, that would impress upon them that the potential for a spiritually significant experience is there, right? Like, we want you to talk to a chaplain because you might have an experience. I mean, this it's a piece in JAMA, in the Journal of American Medical Association. It's a JAMA piece that my colleagues Mason Marks and Glenn Cohen published, a short piece, and it's called Essentials of Informed Consent. And it's incredible to me because and it's crazy, this is published in JAMA, right? It says one of the risks, and I think this is real risks, one of the potential side effects of psychedelic therapy is that a patient might feel as though they are communing with their ancestors, right? You might have this otherworldly, divine, uncomfortable experience. And I think that we owe it, if informed consent is, you have a right to understand what's about to happen and what the risks are, that having a chaplain that can help you maybe understand you might not definitely, and look, there are challenges with expectancy bias. Like, we don't want a chaplain to go in saying you're going to talk to God, but chaplains are uniquely qualified to do what's called a spiritual assessment and maybe at least get some background information on a patient so that if during the session something comes up, the care team will be prepared to help address it. So that's the preparation. For the experience, chaplains are trained in what's called holding space, in creating safe containers, safe environments where people can feel comfortable with whatever comes up. Chaplains are typically there when people are dying, when people are sick, when people are having really difficult experiences. And so they're well equipped to be there when someone is having a psychedelic experience. And then the integration piece. So psychedelic or chaplains can help with meaning making, connecting people to community, helping people find sources like that might speak to them. Um, uh, I think integration, that's an important piece of it, but I think the preparation experiences maybe even more. I mean, I think having someone who during your integration who was with you during your earlier stages might again just help you really be able to make the most of the experience that you have. Um, so then, I'm a law professor, and this piece is in a volume called The Law and Policy of Psychedelic Medicine. So then I get into some of the legal and regulatory challenges, which may be unique to the United States. But basically, on the FDA context, there's been an exclusion of chaplains in terms of monitors that are approved, because there has been some FDA guidance in terms of psychedelic research. On the state level, there has been a move to create sort of these clinical licenses in Colorado and in proposed legislation in California, which didn't pass. So making sure that if there is going to be a clinical license, meaning a healthcare, spiritual care professional could practice under their license, then that includes chaplains. And it's actually interesting, so in Oregon, because it's federally illegal from the beginning, and it's changing a little bit, but still, in Oregon, if you were a medical doctor, you actually could not practice psychedelic services under your medical license. And they had limits. You couldn't even have, you had to get a different office. You had to pay a different rent. And part of that has to do with the licensing. But I think trying to close that gap and allowing spiritual care providers to utilize their license under the state level programs would be good. And then again, of course, including them in the FDA context would be even better. There already are chaplains involved in research and also especially in ketamine therapy administration. And I think that there's also opportunities for chaplains to be involved in training programs as part of the state regulated models. I think that there could be certification programs in divinity schools, like where I went, where chaplains are trained that specifically focus on psychedelic ethics. You're starting to see a little bit. There is, for example, Berkeley in California, University of California in Berkeley has a facilitator training program, and they have a chaplain who's a part of that. I think it's messy here right now, but already it was messy when it comes to psychedelic law. So, you have a few states that have these programs that are training facilitators, but there's no clear way for a provider to know if you're licensed in Oregon, is that going to be true in Colorado? And, so it's messy. And so I think there's still a lot to come, hopefully. And I'll just, in conclusion, just say, I'll just say I got into this because I think psychedelics have promise, but there also are risks, and we've seen risks. We've seen harm has occurred. I don't think that spiritual care, it's necessary, as I argue. I don't think it's optional. I think it is absolutely necessary if we're going to have an ethical and medically effective practice. I think that if we can integrate spiritual care providers, ideas around spiritual care into legal psychedelic frameworks, we can reduce harms associated with psychedelics. And I don't think they're inherently harmful. I actually think that a lot of the harms come from the relationships between therapist and patient, or clinician and patient. And like I said, the goal is to heal as many people as you can for as long as you can. And I think this is a big part of that. So that is my shtick. And I said this to our wonderful hosts. I'm happy to answer questions if you have, or just to hear more about what you think about this work. But I also am happy, to the extent that you are interested, which maybe not, to talk about U.S. American psychedelic law more generally. So I teach on this topic, I write on this topic. So it is an area of expertise, and I am happy to share more. So thank you for listening. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all.
Thank you for your engaging talk, Victoria. I really liked it.
Thank you.
And I want to remind everyone to write your questions to the Q&A. We have a lot of time left for talk and questions. First, I would like to ask a few questions of my own. And just first a comment that the situation in Finland is very different because all use of psychedelics is currently prohibited outside of very limited research contexts. And we do not have legal psychedelic churches or anything like it yet. And I think that many of us look at what is happening at the States and we want to learn from those approaches. And maybe my first question is that is there anything that, like, what is the most important things that you have like learned from how things have been unfolding recently?
Yeah. I mean, I would just say what is interesting about especially the church movement, but also psychedelic use more generally, is that even though we have these legal programs in a few states and we have FDA possibilities, a huge majority of use in the United States is still illegal, right? It's still and I didn't mention this, but we've had a lot of local reform. So we have federal government and then we have state governments. And then within the states, we have like cities and localities. And so there's been a lot of effort, starting in Denver now 6 years ago, but spread all across different parts of the US. We have these decriminalization measures. The idea is, we're going to make it not criminal for you to possess or cultivate or share. But in reality, the local law can't change the state law. So they're not really decriminalization. They really deprioritize enforcement of state law in local jurisdictions. But like the truth is that, I don't know, like there's so many crazy things happening in the US right now, and drug law enforcement is just not a priority at all. I mean, certainly if ICE wanted to, and find a reason to arrest someone, they could use drugs, but they're not even giving a reason. So it's not even like drugs is like motivating harm. Historically in the United States, in the late 20th century, early 21st century, starting in the 80s and 90s, we had a really serious war on drugs effort where police were incentivized by the federal government to go around and arrest people and put them in prison for minimal drug crimes, mostly marijuana, cannabis, not psychedelics. So I guess one of the things you have learned is like, just because you make it legal doesn't mean that people are just going to go into the legal market, but I do think it makes people feel better. I think, I mentioned this piece I have called "Why We Need to Talk About Psychedelic Dispensaries." I know it's hard because, we think these are really powerful. We think that people should be careful. We want people to be able to access them safely. And if we overinflate like the fear and the risk, then we make it harder for people to access them. So I think that's like the double-edged sword. But in the US, it's kind of like the cat's out of the bag, and the states are just like, we're not going to wait for the federal government because our federal government's not functioning. So that's like to the benefit, I think, of psychedelic exploration. Because like New Mexico just passed a law like 2 months ago that legalized psilocybin in a medical sort of framework under the state. And they didn't even ask about federal law. They weren't like, oh, should we care that it's federally illegal? Like, no. It's like we've kind of given up on our federal law. So that's to our benefit. I don't know. I don't know what if you have a stable government where people are enforcing laws, then maybe it doesn't work so well. But I think I maybe I'm a bit of a radical in this, but I think we should legalize all drugs. It would be safer for everyone, and make a dispensary where people could get every drug if the goal was to reduce deaths and harms caused by drug overdose or drug addiction. But in the United States, our drug policy is more driven by like racism and greed. And so the reality on the ground versus the law are very different. And religion is this weird carve out because we have a constitution that protects religion. And so people try and use that to their benefit. I hope I answered some of that. I think it's just a crazy landscape in the US.
Yeah, it sounds like a really complex situation. One question I wanted to ask is actually related to the inner healer topic that you mentioned. Because actually, my research topic of my doctoral dissertation is to give a scientific account of the inner healing intelligence. And I'm using systems theory and also like theories of enactive cognition to approach the question. But I also agree that this kind of reified inner healer concept can also lead to abuse in many settings. And I think that especially like very damaging experiences can be justified by claiming that those difficulties are like just part of the process and part of the inner healing intelligence, and like that is a danger of that approach. Mm. But in the future, there is a possibility that the like emerging theoretical account of that intelligence could be quite complex and distant from how the concept is being actually used in practical therapeutic settings. So, what kind of procedures should be in place to obtain consent to accept theoretical frameworks for healing? And is this kind of question completely unique to psychedelics?
I want to read your work. That sounds so interesting. I'm glad that sometimes the inner healer can be a bit uh, controversial in a way because people are like,
Mm,
why are you critiquing something that is so true or so valuable? But I think, like you said, the consent piece is really big. I mean, I think that this is one of the challenges and maybe it's not just in psychedelic therapy. I mean, I think I saw this in the chat, like, how do you consent to something that is like, and I can let that question be asked, but how you consent in general is like to anything is kind of hard. Like, how does a doctor impress upon or a clinician or anyone, like a religious leader, that, oh, you might have a transformational or you might have an experience? I mean, when I think about like a non-psychedelic context, in theory, I get to consent about if I want to go see a therapist. Do I want to use psychoanalysis? Do I want to use cognitive behavior therapy? Do I want to use, and so I could see it being like that, but that assumes a more sophisticated patient who understands the differences between those different frameworks. So I don't know. And then I think about it a lot in a religious context because I actually am pretty active in a religious community. I'm married to someone who's clergy. And so people come to religious communities and there is no consent process. There's sort of like an implicit consent. There's like, oh, I come here. And so by the nature of coming here, I'm consenting to whatever. And so it feels this weird, like, medical religion divide where we have this like, oh, you need to consent but then in the religious context, it's like, oh, you're consenting by just going and you don't necessarily have all the information. So I don't have the answer. I think it's a really good question. I mean, I believe a lot in the power of inner healing. I think even just consenting, like maybe giving someone literature like your work or other people's work and saying like, this is a model that might help you. Here are some of the benefits of this model. Here are some of the risks of this model.
mm.
And then letting someone, make a choice based on that.
Yeah, that kind of approach sounds quite wise, actually. There's a comment on the chat asking that if I have published any of my work around this inner healing intelligence, and could I share it? Unfortunately, not yet, but I'm in the process of writing my first article. And actually, we could take one question from the Q&A at this point. And there's a question from Esenia Cassidy, and I would like Esenia to ask the question him or herself.
Sure. Happy to. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Victoria. Very enriching. Yeah, I was just the one, at some point you mentioned the consenting to a transformative experience just before this like very recent passage. We just discussed consent now, so I don't know if it's redundant, but it's like this old, ethical, bioethical questions, particularly in relation to psychedelic research. But I think it's a bigger question than this. Can someone actually consent to a transformative experience? Because we know that the nature of transformative experiences is such that you don't know what they are like until, after they happened. And they could be a shock to the system, ontological shift, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, the one answer is you do the best you can to explain to someone. I don't know, and the other, I mean, another piece of that is we worry about you priming someone for that type of experience when you tell them, oh, you might have this type of experience, then maybe they'll have that type of experience. But I don't know how powerful it's a question of how powerful suggestibility is. Excuse me. I will say I have a colleague at my Harvard project, and she is uh she's indigenous and also a psychiatrist, and is working on a piece of writing about this, and sort of like how ideas around informed consent can clash with sort of like an indigenous way of approaching psychedelics. And one of the ways she talks about, her name is Pilar Hernandez. One of the ways she talks about it is that in a more traditional use of psychedelics, the mystery, the not knowing, is part of the divine experience. Like if you're trying to tell someone, it's just echoing your question of like, well, if the transformational experience is transformational and you don't know what it is, then there is no way to consent to it because you don't know what it is. And consent implies like knowledge. And so, I think that goes back into, Ansi's question, right? Like, I think just telling people that this is a risk. I do recommend the Essentials of Informed Consent piece that my colleagues published in JAMA. But it's a tough question. I think it's also just another area where we see this clash between medicine and medical ethics and like philosophy and spirituality and religion. And there's just like not an easy answer. But I'm on the side of like telling people more is better.
I really like that. Thank you. And also on like a related topic, since we discussed inner healing intelligence quite a few times already today, does your colleague have any insight into that from, the framework they practice or brought up in? Because I'm not a clinician, but I have a clinical training, and I'm a psychedelic researcher. I'm sort of getting tired of critique by non-clinicians of what the clinical process should or could look like. And I just wonder if there's like a wider maybe gap between the disciplines such that clinicians trained for, providing psychedelic assisted services and non-clinicians will never understand each other. And therefore, like I keep non-clinicians, and I think Ansi just now sort of mentioned concerns with inner healing intelligence. And I don't know actually Ansi's training, maybe I'm wrong here, but yeah, it strikes me as like a bigger disciplinary need for dialogue, perhaps, because it's kind of like the same argument gets brought up over and over again in the contexts we all are acutely familiar with, and it's not productive or necessarily, leading to some sort of tangible outcomes or being helpful to people who might be suffering from those situations.
Yeah, certacertainly the interdisciplinary nature of psychedelics is both an opportunity and a problem, I myself, I have a divinity degree, but I'm not a clinician. I'm like writing about it from an ethical questioning, but building on the work of clinicians. I don't know that I've asked Pilar about inner healer, though I could. I think that she's expressed in other indigenous perspective clinicians that I've spoken to, right? That like the idea that we're going to like fit under the like some people ask, oh, well, how do we respect indigenous practices in the clinic? Don't bring it in the clinic. You know what I mean? Like you're already like trying to fit a traditional religious indigenous way of interacting with the world into a medical synthetic clinical environment, and that is itself just a challenge. But I do think your point is really strong of, cross-disciplinary challenges in definition. And I think this goes to Ansi's question too, where I'm not saying inner healer shouldn't be a paradigm. I just think transparency and consent, that it is a paradigm and not necessarily an inherent truth, would benefit patients, especially those that don't find that they have an inner healer. And then that can be really damaging, right? Oh, well, I was told that I would be able to heal myself, and now I'm not, and I'm a failure, and I'm the worst, and it's my fault, and I'm the problem, that kind of frame.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you so much. Great answer and a great talk. Thank you again, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. I'm still here. I'm just going to let my dog in. She's just in and out. Come here, dog. Sorry about that. This is what happens when you work from home on a beautiful day. My dog wants in, my dog wants out. All right.
One question that came to my mind was that psychedelic use happens most commonly in unsanctioned contexts, like among friends or parties, etc. And I think this is the case even in places where like psychedelic are like legalized, at least in like when there's a facilitator present. What do you think about peer support groups which experiment in democratizing this kind of psychedelic spiritual care and approaching it communally?
I think that's great. I think that's probably ideal. And there's some interesting scholars. It's right now Harvard is like sort of like a bit of a mecca for psychedelic humanities. So like non-medical research in the law school and the divinity school and the arts and sciences. And so there are a few colleagues of mine there who are writing about like psychedelic use in like at Burning Man, right? Or at like and I mean I even think like at in your friend's backyard, right? That's more when I envision what ideal psychedelic use would look like for me or for my people, right? That's more aligned. But I also appreciate that that's not going to be what everyone needs. You know, I think there's a huge spectrum of why people come to psychedelics, and you know, there's this like what people call the betterment of well people, of like, oh, this is going to be. I don't think it's. I mean, when something is medical versus recreational adult, like these are blurry lines, right? Because we at least in the US we prescribe a lot of people drugs to make them happy. So if you know, if improving your mood is a medical imperative and taking some mushrooms with your friends while you're camping improves your mood, then maybe it's medical use, even if we wouldn't call it clinical medical use. But you're going to want different points of entry for different people. And I think for, you know, it's one of the challenges of the FDA research framework is that for example, you know, MDMA assisted therapy for severe treatment resistant PTSD, you're doing trials with people that are very are suffering, right? This is like a really extreme group that really needs access. But needs it maybe in a different way. And maybe they would also benefit from doing it outside with their friends. But I think there's also like risks. I mean, I think the whole therapeutic aspect of the psychedelic therapy is like a big open question mark. And I find that really interesting. But I mean, to Senia's point, like I'm not a clinician, so I'm not going to say, oh, I think that like, you know, this is the right therapeutic approach to helping people maximize the benefit of psychedelics. I think my job as like a lawyer is to think about like safety. And I think that if we, at least in the US, if we say, oh, if you want to access regulated psychedelics, you have to go into this like facilitated use on-site consumption model, that many people are not going to do that. And they can't if they're not going to pay for it. And they don't want to do psychedelics that way. And I actually think everyone is safer if we can at least make as much use as possible legal use, even if it's like decriminalized use, because then if something does happen, you know, you can access emergency services, you can go to a hospital, you can, if you like, I don't know. I mean, like even like a classic, like obviously I don't want to speak anything into an existence, but you have your friends over in your backyard to do mushrooms and someone trips and breaks their leg, you know, and you want to like go to the doctor, or let's say you're at a campground and you trip over something and you want to sue them in like tort law. That's a US thing. We want to sue everyone, but you know, you want to recover for the expenses, for your medical expenses. If you're under the influence of psychedelics, you're not going to be able to do that if it's illegal, right? Or there's going to be more hesitancy to do that. So I want to make all of it legal. And like I said, I think this spiritual care facilitated use model that I talked about today is like is harm reduction. It's like I don't think you should have to do it necessarily in that model for everyone, but if you are, we should make it better.
Thank you. Very good answer. Related to the topic, I also have another question, but I want to say that I think it's really good distinction to make. Just like separate if we're talking about people who like suffer from mental health problems, or like people who are doing it for either fun or religious purposes, or like any other thing than the clinical use. But one thing I've also been thinking is that could there be kind of a driver's license for psychedelics? Because like, for example, in freediving context where like people dive underwater with like only the breath that they have in their lungs, they have to like have a training for that in order that they can like join a group of divers and go to these places where people dive. So perhaps there could be like something similar in psychedelic context, that you're like allowed to go to this party or use like psychedelics in a certain setting, provided that you have like some basic training for doing so. What do you think about that kind of approach?
I like that approach. I mean, I think it's like my ideal approach is we have a dispensary where you can just go and use it as you please. My I feel like that's like your approach is almost like an in between. Like it's a question of what does it look like to get that license, right? Like in the context of cannabis in the US, we have medical cannabis licenses, which function kind of similarly. I mean, you have to go to a doctor, but in most states, many states, I wouldn't say most, if you have money, you can get a medical card, right? Like there's the access piece, but you can get a card and then you can go access. I've also I don't know if I've published about this, but it's been an idea I've had in my mind for a while of like, almost like, I don't know if you have gun ranges, but like a psychedelic gun range or like a psychedelic retreat center where you can go to the place, but you don't have to have a facilitator. You could just say, oh, we're going to go to this retreat center, and when we check in the retreat center, we can like get some psychedelics and we can use them on site, right? So we create like an environment where it's safe, where people can use it, just like we might have a gun range where someone can go and like shoot a gun, but then they're not supposed to shoot it off. I mean, I think it is hard because this is an aside, but our gun, like we don't even have like background checks in many places for guns. So like the idea that we're gonna like create this system for psychedelics is kind of I think a pipe dream, but I think it's a good idea. I think Rick Doblin has like put that out there, and people push back on it, but he's can be controversial about it. But there is a proposal in actually New York, related to mushrooms, New York State, that is similar. It's like a permit program like that, but it's kind of weird because it's like regulated by the Department of Health, and then basically the idea behind a lot of these programs is like innovative ideas is like let's make it easier for states. Like if you require a state to regulate a lot, then it's a burden and it's expensive, and then they don't do it. So this New York proposal, which is a permit-based proposal, is like you could get a permit and then you could like buy from someone else who grows mushrooms. But there still, I think, is this need for the government or probably the government to regulate the drug itself, so that it's safe. And so I think that is some of the challenge. But I mean, I don't think it's on its face, I don't think it's a bad idea. I just think like how does it the driver's license for psychedelics, but the closest thing we have to it is like a medical cannabis card.
Okay, yeah, thanks for the answer. I believe that it can get like quite complex, and US is a very big country compared to, for example, Finland. So I think that it would be like a really difficult problem to like go that route.
I mean, I could see a state. I mean, but you would still need the dispensary, is the point. You see what I'm saying? Like, I don't know if you didn't have a way to get it, then the license would be. I don't know. It's an interesting. I'll think about it. Yeah, it's a good question.
We have some questions in the Q&A that I would like to read next because they are anonymous, so I will read them myself. The first question here is, please talk about legislature and criminal cases resulting in the permission for particular ayahuasca or peyote churches that use psychedelics in their rituals. How do they fit in this picture? And possible extra question, thinking about the worries about brainwashing, should people engaging in particular religious context be encouraged to have contact with chaplains or other professionals who don't attach their support work to a particular religious tradition?
Yeah, these are all good questions. So I'm going to do an order that makes sense to me. So I will talk about the law related to churches last, because that's a bit longer. When I think about how they fit into the picture of what I've been talking about today, I kind of mentioned this. I think if you go to church, there's this idea that you're consenting to church. And so what happens there, and that goes to your extra question, which I think is a good one. But in reality, in the US, I would say a lot of people do go to churches to access psychedelics because the other forms of access aren't as available. So you can't go to a psychedelic dispensary unless you live in Colorado. You can't really just go anywhere that's like semi-legal to buy psychedelics. Although I say that, and there are in most states, many states, there are ways to get psychedelics. So churches are this weird area where like there is sincere religious use, and then there's also people going to churches and forming churches because they have no other way to use psychedelics and they think it will protect them. One interesting thing in Colorado is that under their state law, they protect religion and non-religion the same, which I think is good. If you want to have spiritual support, you can have that. If you want to have harm reduction, therapeutic support, you can have that without regulation. And I think that's good because you don't want the government deciding what is religion, what's not religion. That gets messy. So that's kind of how they fit in. The extra question, I think that's a great idea that if you are doing, if you're in, I mean, generally, I mean, the study of cults and religion and ideology is fascinating. It is not quite my expertise, but I'm gonna pull back up the question. But how do we alleviate the risks of people being brainwashed is a huge question. I wish I had all the answers. But certainly I think if someone feels that they're being brainwashed or being because the line between brainwashing and being influenced in a way that you feel good about is like, who gets to decide, right? Like it's like if someone is a Catholic and they're a strong believer, me, a non-Catholic, might say they seem like they've been brainwashed. They might be like, oh, well, I feel like this is a meaningful, beneficial, formative, transformational, like experience, and then, but there's extremes, right? Like when you have a cult where people like kill themselves or each other, that's obviously an extreme. And you have people who leave cults and they're like, I've been brainwashed. But when someone realizes they've been brainwashed or what it means to be brainwashed is a really, really tough issue. Like I said, I think just having an extra layer of protection where someone who's trained, and again, this is ideal that a chaplain would not impose their own views, but there are certainly bad chaplains. So it's not a perfect solution either. But I think that's a really good question. The legislature in criminal cases in ayahuasca or peyote churches. So I've written a bunch about this, so I don't want to give you the like super long version, but I can point you to, I have a piece called Psychedelic Policy, Religious Freedom, and Public Safety. It's a long article. It gives this whole history. I have a shorter piece called Psychedelics, the DEA, and Regulating Religion in the Cato Institute, which is a think tank. That's a shorter version. But the like 2-minute version is that peyote and the use of peyote by Native American churches was protected under a federal law earlier, like in the 80s, 70s, sort of like this Native, American Indian Religious Freedom Act. I think it actually passed in 2000, but there was this like grandfathered in protection of the native use of peyote. But there, in terms of like modern religious protections, there is a really famous case called Division v. Smith, which I talk about in both of those papers that I just mentioned. That was in like 1990. That changed the law relating to religion in the US generally. And there was a federal law passed. Basically, in that case, I'm like, I don't want to get too in the weeds, but they said that in that case, a peyote using church members couldn't be exempt from criminal laws. It's kind of a bad decision. And Congress said our federal government said that's a bad decision. And they passed a law, which is the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And that is our main federal law involving religious freedom. And in 2006, there was a psychedelic church, UDV, that brought a case under that law that allowed for them to use ayahuasca in a religious context. And there was another church, the Santo Daime, who also brought a case under that federal law in the early 2000s and got the right to use ayahuasca in their ceremony. From that, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, put out this petition process where churches could apply for federal permission to use drugs. And until a few months ago, they never granted one in almost 20 years. But they did just grant one to this church, Gaia Church. So you can look up that news. And last spring, there was another church, the Church of the Eagle and Condor, who also like brought a lawsuit and then they settled with the DEA. So that means we have 1, 2, 3, 4 churches now that have these federal exemptions that allow for them to use ayahuasca. The peyote, like I said, is sort of this different Native American law. But the DEA exemptions actually are pretty strict. Like they're really heavily regulated. You have to like register with the DEA where you're getting your sacrament from. You have to have really intense storage requirements. So there already are religious people that are like believe that burdens those requirements burden their religious freedom. So even though like exemption is problematic, and many churches just don't apply for it and don't care. And all of the churches that have it use ayahuasca, but there are a lot of churches that use psilocybin, MEODMT, even LSD. There's all kinds of church drama in the US that I'll leave for you to Google if you're interested in. In my long law review article, I think in both those articles, I argue that we should just presume that all the churches are legal and then we should regulate them, and that would make it safer. Because right now you have this like burden where the DEA is supposed to decide whether a church is a church. And I don't think the law enforcement should be making that decision. So I hope that was helpful, but you can go read my work, and I appreciate that question.
Thank you for your answer. The next question in the Q&A is, what do you think are the most relevant aspects of what a chaplain would do that a well-trained psychotherapist or other mental health professional would not do, or would be relevantly less likely to do? I'm thinking of the counter-argument that it's enough for mental health professionals to get spiritual training, excluding the obvious element of the cheaper cost. Also, do you think there are areas that spiritual chaplains without mental health training might neglect or be under-equipped to handle, perhaps related to serious mental health crises or personality disorders, etc.?
Yeah, these are both great questions. I mean, I think the most relevant aspects of what a chaplain would do that a psychotherapist would not do, most psychotherapists, one is religious literacy. So, if a patient brings up a religion text, belief in a certain type of God, belief in a holy text of some kind, a chaplain would be way more likely to understand the context and be responsive to that context, because a mental health professional is not trained in religion, right? And at least, I'd be interested to learn maybe more what it's like in Finland, but in the US, like most people are still born into, I don't know, it's changing all the time, but many people have either a relationship to religion or a strong, no, I'm not religious because I was born Catholic and I don't like that. Or I was forced to go to church, or, I wasn't brought up in any religion, but I believe in XYZ horoscope, astrology. I don't know, right? Like there's a whole like religious studies literature around, that there's really no such thing as like a secular identity, that like everyone is shaped by beliefs about the bigger world, whether those are in an organized religion context or not. But anything that touches on any idea of traditional religion, I mean, most Americans, if they're not another religion, celebrate Christmas. Even like secular Americans celebrate Christmas, celebrate Easter, right? Those are like holidays that everything is closed and people have off, right? And those have people have ties to religion. So having someone who can be responsive and is trained in that is one. And then the other is that religious countertransference, which maybe a mental health professional is trained to not, to prevent countertransference, right? Like, I don't want to project my own, like, it's my job as the therapist and I'm not a therapist, but, and this is a good question, right? And this is, presenting this work in an interdisciplinary context. If someone else wants to write about this, like, please do. My understanding is that a therapist is not supposed to make it about them. The therapist is supposed to be there for the patient. And a chaplain is specifically trained to, when something religious comes up, be able to do that work. And I think that's a skill that you practice. Like, I think that like there's clinical pastoral education, CPE, and part of that is a group supervision aspect. So chaplains are out, they're in a hospital, they're in hospice care, they're meeting with patients, and then they're coming back together in a group setting with an instructor, and they're talking about the experience, and they're reflecting on the experience, and they're trying to make sure that they didn't unintentionally make it about them, for lack of a better way to say it, right? Do you think that there are areas that spiritual chaplains without mental training might neglect or be? Yeah. So, I mean, this goes back to the question of like who's accessing where. I'm not ready to say, oh, a spiritual care provider should be the only clinician if someone has a severe mental health disorder. I think they should be part of the care team. But then it's interesting because in the state regulated context, like I said, the requirements are that you have like a high school diploma, right? There is no requirement that you're a clinician in order to provide psychedelic services, which is, I think, really counter to this idea that these are like medicines with strict medical uses. But I think that we go like that there's going to be multiple points of entry. And I do think that spiritual care, education, could be, shape all of them. And perhaps even more in a situation where someone has a serious crisis or disorder, that you need multiple members of a care team as part of that process. And maybe, like some people, religious trauma is really core, and some people it's not. And I think that's where the spiritual assessment is an important piece, and then deciding what makes sense for this person during the experience element. But these are really great questions.
Yeah, am I understanding you correctly? Are you like saying that there might come up religious matters or like experiences related to religious matters that psychotherapists alone might not be like equipped to handle? Like, for example, if I'm a Buddhist and I would suffer from depression, I would like apply to psychedelic therapy. But then like something comes up that for example, I have an insight that my ability for having to have compassion for other sentient beings is limited in some important sense, that the therapist might not like be able to really catch on because we're like not on the same path. But then I could have an access to a Buddhist chaplain that I could like talk about this experience, about the limits of compassion and how to approach that and so on.
Yeah, I think that's a great example.
The next question is mentioned to legalization. You mentioned legalizing all drugs. Would it be enough to have milder types of drugs from different categories, like in case of opioids? Would it be enough to have something like opium and milder synthetic opioids? Do you think something like heroin would be necessary to have legally available? How would you balance the harmful effects of increased availability? I assume that heroin is not that widely available in the US currently.
Yeah, that's a good question. I struggle because my initial response is, well, maybe we have like I do think there's an argument for milder versions of certain drugs. Heroin's a tough one because heroin is accessible, but not as accessible as fentanyl. But from the research that I've seen about drug overdoses, like if the goal is to prevent drug use, then I don't know how we do that. Right? Like people want to use drugs, and like in the US, I don't know what it's like in Finland, but like alcohol is everywhere. And I get frustrated because, with cannabis, which I also research and teach on, it's like you can have this amount of cannabis, but like I can go buy a keg of alcohol, right? Like I could drink myself to death easily. Like I don't drink really because it's not my pleasure, but like I could go to a liquor store and buy the whole store. Like there's no limit. Like I could buy a ton and I could kill myself. So I don't know why we treat alcohol that way and we treat other drugs so differently, because it's not really about lethality. Like if it's about what can kill you, then we wouldn't have alcohol be legal, or Advil, like ibuprofen, right? Like that can kill you if you take enough. And we sell a bottle of in the US of 60 ibuprofen, and if I had the whole bottle, I would die. I don't, right? Like I take the recommended dose. And you could argue that there's like an addictive aspect to that, but like alcohol is pretty addictive. So I mean, I think if the goal is safety. When I read research, I was saying this about drug overdose. A lot of drug overdose happens because people don't know what they're taking. Right? It's not like, oh, because you use heroin, you're going to die from heroin. It's because, well, you're addicted to heroin, but you can't actually get heroin. So you're trying to get fentanyl. Maybe the fentanyl has something else in it. Maybe the fentanyl is way stronger than the heroin and you don't know how much you're taking. And then you take too much and then you overdose. Right. And then you die. And so if the goal is to save lives, I'm not sure it matters whether it's the milder version or the stronger version. I mean, I could have all these theories, like a thought experiment of like, well, if we legalize all drugs and make them all available, then maybe people would do less drugs. I don't actually think that's the route. I think, unfortunately, drugs are sort of like besides the like personally, spiritually, intellectually enriching nature and the healing nature, they're also a coping mechanism in a world that's really tough. So I think if we wanted to solve the like drug overdose crisis in the US, we would need to like provide people with housing and food and opportunity and medical care, right? Like that is actually the root of some of these challenges. But sometimes I've learned like you have ideas and proposals and I can say I think we should legalize all drugs. I really do. I don't think that it's that realistic. But I think it's worth talking about because it opens up the door for these kind of conversations.
Right. I can also believe that if something like milder, like opium or something like much milder than heroin would be like available for people, then perhaps they would not seek heroin or fentanyl or something like that. But those are really complex questions and they really depend on the like context. And for example, if there are a lot of people who already have like problems with strong opiates, then the situation is also very different than in a place where like there is not currently like an opioid problem. But that is a really complex topic.
And cost, right? That's a big one. Like people get into heroin because they get prescribed opioids and then they can't afford the opioids. And so then they get into heroin, and then they can't find or afford heroin. So then they do fentanyl. I mean, there's like a cost element. So like if every drug cost the same, or if they were free, I don't know. I mean, it would be a great experiment, like how people would react to that.
The next question in the Q&A is, would you agree that an intense psychedelic experience usually involves some kind of ego dissolution and phenomenologically tend to be accommodated better by non-dual frameworks than traditional dualistic conceptions of divinity?
I don't know. I think that wades into like the scientific stud. I mean, there is like a spiritual element to that. But I mean, the lawyer answer is it depends. I don't know. It depends where someone does it, and how they're doing it and what they're doing and who they're doing it with and what their intention is when they go into it and what kind of setting they have. And I agree with the idea that different frameworks may be useful for different types of experiences. Yeah, man, that's a good question, but I know when my expertise is exceeded.
Yeah, and there's a difficult question because like even though like someone could be like a quite conservative Christian and like have a ego dissolution experience, but the religious framework will have an effect on how the experience is interpreted and how it is approached. So even though like some non-dual frameworks in theory like could be applicable, then there's also that someone might not just like shift from one spiritual path to another just because like they had some kind of an experience. It probably will have some kind of an integration like between the views, and there could be like or that can get quite complex also like really fast when we approach like topics like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the presumption that I'm making in this work is, which maybe it's not a fair one, but if someone comes in with this, well, it depends on the person. I'm not necessarily making this presumption. I'm making the presumption that if we have a chaplain in the room who does a spiritual assessment, they could maybe evaluate what framework someone is coming from and what frameworks they're open to using to help integrate. So I don't know if there's an inherent, I mean, I think, okay, I mean, ego dissolution might be a bit far, but that everyone would have that. But do psychedelics have a strong capacity to dissolve binaries and help you access some psychedelics in some settings, a more holistic, non-dual understanding? Certainly. I mean, I think the like data kind of just how psychedelics have influenced culture, and other, like you see that, like with Judaism, like I'm Jewish, a lot of the researchers, like Ram Dass was Jewish, and went to India and did psychedelics and brought it back, and then like had this new like Jewish Buddhist, like non-dual dual like integration, right? Because they're like, oh, I mean, and there's like, a movement in American Judaism, Christianity, Islam to integrate psychedelics. And so I think there are aspects to these more dualistic frameworks that can be non-dual, because no religion tradition is a monolith. But certain traditions, I think like Buddhism, are, more maybe aligned with perceptions of reality that can be initiated by psychedelics. And so that you see that movement of people who are like, oh, I came from a more, traditional religion into, well, I don't know what traditional means, but like broaden my conception of reality by use of psychedelics. So I think that anecdotal evidence supports that idea. What a good question.
Yeah. The next question in the Q&A is the following. It's actually looks like a few questions. I'd love to hear more about your perspectives regarding the experiments of different US states with crafting a more permissive legislature for utilizing psychedelics. What do you think have been the most important lessons learned? And would you say there have been some legal frameworks that have worked especially poorly, or that could have been done a lot better? And in the context of psychedelics, I'd also like to hear you speak a bit about the idea of the states forming a laboratory for trying out different legislatures and learning from each other instead of having just one set of laws for the whole US.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think one important lesson is, I mean, and it's so hard because right now I'm, and this kind of gets to the next question too, but I'm doing some writing, if you, we got a lot, like I said, we got a lot going on in the US right now in terms of our like stability of our government and the relationship between our federal government and our state governments. And so, I think we're entering sort of a different era in the relationship between our federal and our state governments. Because the federal governments are pulling a lot of money and resources, and our federal government is just shrinking, right? There's like the firing of thousands of employees of our federal government. So the shape of our country and the power and sovereignty and law is changing. And that's something I'm like writing about, not just about drugs, but more generally. So I think it's interesting because in some ways, like the states that are just like, we're going to do this, who cares about federal law? Like when cannabis was legalized initially in the late 90s, there was a lot of pushback from the federal government. There was like the federal government like trying to arrest people, trying to enforce federal law. And with psychedelics, we just haven't seen it because we don't have a functioning federal government, and it's not a priority. And so it's allowed the states to be more ambitious, I think, and see what they can do. I mean, you've seen some. So I mentioned Oregon has a Psilocybin Services Act. New Mexico just passed a Medical Psilocybin Act. Colorado has what's called the Natural Medicine Health Act. We also have seen states like Texas just invested a bunch of money in researching Ibogaine, which is interesting, which is also like federally legal. So, I mean, one most important lesson learned is the states aren't waiting. And I think that's encouraging and exciting. I think it's hard when your country is like crumbling sliding into fascism. I mean, like, it's just like what is happening in the US. So you're like, okay, what do we do about it? And the states saying, okay, well, sometimes I think about this work of like, okay, well, things are really bad and people are suffering, and states are seeing that and trying to step in and create ways for people to access medicine. And so that's exciting and energizing. And I hope that we'll see that. We already are seeing that in other areas of law where states are like, okay, we're going to try and do things to protect our citizens. So I think that's almost exciting in a way for psychedelics. Like we'll see what other states do. On the other hand, like drug policy, if you don't have funding for education, drug policy becomes less important. But for things that have worked especially poorly, the cost. So even though the federal government has said, okay, we're going to pull out basically of enforcement, the states are still subject. There's like a federal tax called, the section is 280E, but I mean, it's just basically in the US tax system, businesses can take deductions on money that they invest in the business. But if you're trafficking illegal drugs under the federal law, you can't. So the tax rate on cannabis businesses and psychedelic businesses is significant. And that's not really something the state can control, unfortunately, for now. And so it's hard to, I guess the point of me saying that is it's hard to evaluate the success of the state programs because they're still hindered by the remnants of federal law, even if it's not being widely enforced. Something that I think has been really good is Colorado's law, where they have a regulated framework and they have a decriminalized social sharing framework. But we're going to see how that plays out, because when you have two competing markets, there's incentive for cracking down on the unregulated market when the state has an interest in the regulated market in terms of tax revenue. So I don't know. New Mexico is an interesting example. So Oregon was explicitly non-medical. Colorado is called the Natural Medicine Health Act, but it's not explicitly medical either. In New Mexico, there's a list of qualifying conditions. And the idea is you're going to go to your doctor and then they're going to like recommend that you use psilocybin, and then you're going to be able to go somewhere. It's not clear where, whether it could be a doctor's office or whether it will be another regulated place. I mean, what I hope would be that we would move towards a dispensary model. I have a piece coming out this summer in the Cato Institute magazine where I argue that we should let cannabis dispensaries sell psychedelics. So there was, like, for example, in Massachusetts, near where I live, there was a ballot proposal that would have legalized psychedelics similar to Colorado. But part of that proposal is that there's a new state regulatory body that is formed, and that would be really expensive. So before it even makes any money for the state would have to invest a lot of money. And I don't think that that's popular, especially, like I said, when we're in a time where states don't have a lot of money because the federal government has pulled out a lot of money. So I think being creative, that's my creative idea right now, is like, okay, well, what if a state like where I live, Rhode Island or Massachusetts, passed a law and they just said, we're going to license people to cultivate mushrooms, and they're subject to all the regulations like a cannabis business, and they can sell it at the cannabis dispensary. And I think that would be like the path of least resistance. So I think that's like trying to make it easier, less burdensome for businesses and for the government. Formerly laboratory trying out different legislative law from each other, so just one side of the US. Yeah, so I think I've touched on the second part of this question a bit, but our US system is very fragmented, where we already do, like, states already do have a lot of power. But the federal law is supposed to be supreme to the state law if there's a conflict. And there is a conflict because federal law, all of these drugs except for ketamine are Schedule 1 on our Controlled Substances Act, which means that there's no medical use, high potential for abuse, and they're completely criminal, like illegal to possess, sell. So all of the state, I mean, now over 45 states have medical cannabis or some kind of cannabis, and all of it is federally illegal. And the federal government doesn't enforce federal law. I don't know. I mean, it's a crazy situation. I feel like I've yabbered on. I hope that you learned something from that. It's a weird time to be thinking about state power in the United States.
Thank you for a really comprehensive answer.
Yeah, sorry. I'm just like, it's...
No, I meant, like, honestly.
Yeah.
The remaining question in the Q&A is that you have also mentioned that you're interested in the U.S. Constitution. Are there areas that connect to your work on psychedelics that you find relevant?
Yeah, this is a great question. So I'm teaching a class on the First Amendment in the fall. I like the First Amendment a lot. That's our freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom to assemble. So the religious freedom questions are really interesting. The question of like who decides what a religion is. But like I said, I think the Colorado law, which removes the need to define religion, anything that we can do to take the government out of deciding religion, I think is a good thing, because we have like a pretty like certain idea of Christian power right now in the US, and that harms non-Christian, non-Catholic religions, and also non-evangelical and any minority religion, right? Our whole ideas around religion in the US, a lot of them are based in Christian ideas around religion and certain types of Christian ideas around religion. And so that can be very harmful. A lot of people have written about that. There was my friend Allison Hoots, her last name is Hoots. She wrote an essay for the Harvard Divinity School about religion and Christianity and Christian, basically, hegemony and ideas around religion in the US. Other areas that are interested, there's a whole bunch, like search and seizures, how do you know when someone's under the influence of psychedelics and all that? That's interesting. I think the last one I'll mention too, I've been talking about the federal state power issue, which is a big one, which, I'm writing about. So if you think that's interesting, connect with me on LinkedIn or something. And then sometime in the next year, you'll see more on that from me. But I do think drug law is a really strong example of an area where the states are just like, we're going to do what we want to do, and we're going to ignore the federal law because the federal government isn't enforcing federal law right now. So that's interesting. And then the last one, I would say we have a commerce clause, which kind of relates to that. So a lot of these federal, like the Controlled Substances Act, which is the federal law making it illegal, is upheld under the commerce clause. So the idea is our federal Congress can regulate things related to interstate commerce. And so kind of the impact of that, without getting too in the weeds, but I published on this too, is that states can't pass laws that burden interstate commerce. So states can do whatever they want, but like if you're going to affect the national marketplace, you can't. And so one of the impacts of that frame of federal and state power is that there's no legal interstate commerce in a drug like cannabis or in psychedelics. So all of these programs are state siloed. So if you're going to get psychedelics in Colorado, it's going to be allegedly grown in the state, processed in the state, whatever, and sold in the state. And like you're restricted to the state. Now you can go from state, like I can go from Rhode Island to Colorado and use it in Colorado, but it, would break, technically it breaks federal law, whether I'm in Colorado or I go out of Colorado, but certainly people have this feeling that if you stay in the state, you're more protected. So I think that the commerce questions are really interesting too. And they kind of get to the core of why the United States exists as it does for now.
Thank you for your answer. I would like to ask one of my own remaining questions at this point. I'd like to hear your thoughts on what are the most important common regulatory principles that should be shared among religious groups, and what kind of aspects could be left to the particular groups to make their own decisions on? And is there not a tension between legalizing psychedelics and, on the other hand, regulating this psychedelic spiritual care?
Okay, the first one I'm going to answer, and then I might ask you to reframe the second one about the tension. I think medical screening, I wish we could have like a figure out how to do that. But I think historically, when people talk about how religious communities should be regulated, some kind of framework for screening. I don't know what we should be screening for, right? That's outside my scope. It's an important question that people are talking about. Like, are there pre-existing conditions that we should screen people out? Or should we, come in at your own risk? It's a liability question. It's a practical question. I think safe supply. And it's hard because I think if people want to cultivate their own mushrooms, then I don't think we should stop them. But I think if a religious community wants to use LSD or MDMA, that they should be able to, and they should have a place to get them. And in the US context, like if a church wants to use wine for a sacrament, they can like go to a liquor store and buy it. And I don't know why that should be different if they want to use a different kind of sacrament. Yeah, I mean, things that should be up to the religion. Is it done individually or is it done in a group I mean, I don't know. I think these are the questions that are going to be litigated and fought over in the, hopefully in the next, I don't know, 20, 30 years. I used to have more confidence that this is like, an area where people are, I think there's just too much else happening in the US context right now where like our legal system is falling apart. So the idea that we're going to have like, courts where people are going to litigate this and fight for this, I don't know. So I think it's going to be more self-regulated. And there's a group called the Spiritual Plant Alliance that my friend Allison is also involved in. And this is some of the work they do, like communities self-regulating. What should we have in place in terms of safety measures, safe supply? I think maybe having a medical, either having a, feeling like having in place a policy so that if something goes wrong, someone falls and breaks their leg. It doesn't have to be something that's related to the psychedelic. That what you're going to do? Are you going to call 911? Are you going to take someone to a hospital? Like, what are your policies in terms of safety? But then things, like what language gets what? Is there music playing? Are we outside? Or are we inside? What are we wearing? Are we eating? Are we eating before? Are we eating after? Is there a diet before or after? Is there the ritual piece is certainly, I think, in the purview of religion. Whereas the before, after supply medical is more in the regulated side. Does that make sense? Does that answer that question?
Yeah, I think it does. I would like to highlight though the second aspect of the question with the tension that I mentioned, because what I have learned from you is that you support the legalization of psychedelics in some sense. But I think that the easier that psychedelics are to access, the harder it might be to regulate the spiritual care aspect of them.
Yeah. So, like I said, I mean, I think when I first got into psychedelics, I don't know, over a decade ago, it was like, oh, I'm interested in religious use and I'm not about medical use and I'm not about recreational use or like whatever. Like I had all these ideas of, I have to choose one area that I think I believe in, and then the others go to the side. But then I think over time I've gained an appreciation that that ideally you have multiple points of access for different people at different times, and that I can think that we should have widespread legalization, and I can be critical of the medical model and want to improve it. Like, even if I can think, like, I'm not saying this, I don't know what I think anymore. I'm always changing my mind. Like, but I could say, oh, I don't think we should have medical use. I don't think psychedelics belong in a medical context. Okay. Like me thinking that might be fun. That's cool. But that's not going to stop the pharmaceutical companies from investing money and trying to push this through in a medical context. And maybe there is data, maybe there is evidence, maybe it would be beneficial for it to be in a medical context. And so then what do I, as someone who is educated about religion, and chaplaincy, what do I have to offer to that model, right? So I've written about like the psychedelic regulation at the state level, and I've written about psychedelic churches, and through my affiliation at Harvard with this Health Law Research Center, I was motivated to think about what can I contribute to the conversations around facilitated use, both in the clinical framework and in the state regulated framework. And I went to divinity school. I know a lot of chaplains. I value their work. And I think this area of psychedelic chaplaincy is, people are starting to talk about it a bit in other like non-legal contexts. That center at Emory that I mentioned, my colleagues at Harvard in the divinity school. So I think I'm uniquely positioned as someone that has a background in theology and religious studies and is also a lawyer and a law professor, to talk about this specifically in terms of the legal aspects. But if I had to choose like, facilitated use or non-facilitated use, I would choose non-facilitated use. But if facilitated use is what we got, then I want to make it better.
Thank you for your answer. I think I now understand this framing much more clearly.
Yeah. No, I think it's a good question.
The last question we have I'd like to take the last, and then we can move to the few ending words and that business. But the last question is, what is your take on psychedelic healing as a holy sacrament of indigenous people, via making it a money-making business? This is not a strictly scientific question, but I think it's really interesting to hear your perspective.
Yeah. I mean, this goes back to like, well, what do I think about it? But what does it matter what I think? I mean, no, I mean, I think ideally we want to respect and protect people's rights to use things that they've been using for all of human history all over the world. I think there's a lot of interesting questions about what does it mean for someone to be indigenous, and who gets to define that. And I think our modern context of what like what a drug is and how it's used, and this whole like modern idea around medicine as like we're going to take a drug and it's going to heal you, is so counter to like an indigenous way of integrating these substances. And I'm a weird person, so I spent time like in Peru studying about like indigenous agriculture, but I didn't do drugs there because I was like, this isn't my context. Like we're talking about two different universes in relationships to drugs, and in an indigenous context, it's really about like relationship to the world, and that these like plants and fungi are like our ancestors and our family, our cousins, our teachers, right. It's like a different orientation and relationship to the world and to yourself. And so, but then it's like, okay, but what do I do about MDMA? MDMA is a synthetic drug made in a lab. Like, is that a holy sacrament of indigenous people, even if it has similar psychoactive effects? Like, I don't know, So this goes back to that question of like, well, how should we honor, like when I first presented this talk, someone's like, well, how should we honor indigenous perspectives in the clinic? And there was an indigenous woman on my panel, and she was like, we don't want to be in the clinic, right? Like like it's like it's almost like sacrilegious to be like, oh, well, I'm going to be able to like honor this indigenous way of relating to the world in a clinical Western medical model. Like we're just talking about two different things. Now, I think it's really problematic and disappointing the way that these industries, this like medical tourism, essentially to the Amazon, has negatively impacted local economies and local people. I think if someone's going to make money, definitely those people should be part of it. I mean, there's not in the US, in Colorado, there was like an indigenous people's working group, but it really just paid lip service. It really didn't, these advisory groups are like, well, look, we got their perspective, but they're not binding. I will say the Petrie Flom Center at Harvard, where I'm at, this coming year, we're going to do some more work with indigenous perspectives. But even that I think is problematic. So I'm like, well, who are we as like, mostly white, like academics to like think that we should talk about indigenous people? But then it's like, well, we're going to bring indigenous people in. But it's like this always of like, how do you uplift and not appropriate? And if we're not going to talk about it, then those people may not be at the table. So I think it's a really it's a tough question. And I don't think it's a binary. I think like the idea of like, oh, well, I don't think people should make this into a business. That's like a line you can draw, but you're not going to stop it at this point.
Thank you so much, Victoria, for being our guest today and being so generous with your time and answering all our questions. I would like to give you the opportunity to say a few last words to us if you want to say anything.
I mean, I guess I'll say thank you. I think I got asked a lot of good questions that always push my thinking. I've been in this world a long time, and so I'm pushing myself in other ways, like to think about, topics I've talked about, federalism and religious freedom. But it's exciting for me to be asked hard questions and to talk about my work. And so I appreciate the invitation, and I would really invite any of you to connect with me on LinkedIn or like, I don't know, Instagram, whatever. And also like the Petrie Flom Center where I'm at does a lot of really great programming. So if you're interested more in the American side of things, and I'll say it, like, I really always wanted to go to Finland. So if there's any other opportunities, like if you do in person, anything, like count me interested. And I've really enjoyed this time. So thank you.